Imagine stepping into a medieval courtroom, where your neighbors, judges, and even priests strip you naked and inspect your body to see if you're fit for marriage. Imagine a wedding night, where the king's nobles gather at the foot of your bed, waiting to confirm that you've had sex. Imagine bishops, men sworn to celibacy, running vast networks of brothels, profiting from the very sins they condemned. This is not folklore. This is history, and the truth about medieval sexuality is far stranger, darker, and more unsettling than anything Hollywood has ever dared to show. Let's pull back the curtain on 7 disturbing realities of medieval sex and intimacy. These aren't the prudish tales you've heard in school, nor the romanticized fantasies of knights and fair maidens. This is about humiliation, hypocrisy, superstition, and raw human survival. In medieval Europe, marriage was not only about love. In fact, love was the least of it. Marriage was a contract, a transfer of property, a political alliance, and that contract wasn't valid until it was consummated, which meant, if a man was accused of impotence, the court had to intervene. Picture this: a man, trembling with fear, ordered to strip in front of physicians, priests, and sometimes even the local magistrates. His body examined, his genitals touched, his ability to perform judged like a horse at market. These were called trials of fitness. In 1370, a man named John Sanderson of York was dragged before such a tribunal. His wife accused him of being incapable of consummation. Doctors inspected him, midwives gave testimony, and the verdict was written in humiliating detail into the court record. The consequences were devastating. If the court declared you unfit, your marriage could be annulled. You could lose your wife, your dowry, your honor, and your social standing, all because of what happened, or failed to happen, between the sheets. Pierre de Franville, a Parisian merchant in the 1450s, became desperate when summoned for such a trial. Terrified of public disgrace, he resorted to swallowing herbal concoctions meant to stimulate his performance. Many contained dangerous doses of mandrake, henbane, or even mercury. Some men poison themselves in their attempts to avoid humiliation. Now imagine living in a world where your private performance wasn't private at all, but a matter for lawyers and priests, where your most intimate failures could end up as public record. And if you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear about weddings, because in medieval Europe, the humiliation didn't end in the courtroom. Sometimes it began at the very altar. The medieval wedding was rarely a private affair. For noble families, it was a political contract. And the consummation was as important as the vows. That's why the wedding night often had witnesses. Take Margaret of Anjou and King Henry VI of England. On their wedding night, in 1445, no fewer than 23 nobles, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, crowded around the royal bed to verify that the marriage had been sealed in flesh. Curtains might be drawn, but the couple knew. Eyes and ears were everywhere. Or consider Catherine of Aragon, who married Prince Arthur of England. The Spanish ambassador personally insisted on confirmation that the marriage had been consummated. Sheets were inspected, testimonies gathered, and rumors spread. When Catherine later denied it had happened, that denial, decades later, gave Henry VIII the excuse to divorce her and sparked the English Reformation. Even centuries later, the ritual lingered. When Marie Antoinette married Louis XVI of France, the pressure to consummate was immense. For 7 years, their failure to produce an heir was dissected not only in court gossip but in political pamphlets across Europe. Midwives and doctors hovered like vultures, turning a young couple's private struggle into a matter of international scandal. For ordinary people, the practice wasn't quite so theatrical, but it still existed. In many towns, families or midwives waited outside the chamber, ready to examine the sheets for signs of consummation. Virginity was not a private matter, it was a public resource, one that determined dowries, inheritances, and reputations. Imagine your first night of marriage, not as an intimate moment, but as a performance staged for judges, ambassadors, and in-laws. That was the reality for countless men and women. But if the nobility turned weddings into political spectacles, the church turned sex itself into a business. We like to think of the medieval church as an institution of morality, forever condemning the sins of the flesh. And indeed, priests preached endlessly against lust, fornication, and adultery. But behind closed doors, the church was making a fortune from the very sins it condemned. Take the Bishop of Winchester, one of the most powerful clerics in England. For centuries, the bishop controlled the Southwark district of London, where he licensed and regulated no fewer than 18 brothels. The women who worked there were known as Winchester geese, and they paid taxes directly to the bishop's office. Some of that money funded churches and even cathedrals. In France, bishops in Avignon openly ran what were essentially papal brothels. In Germany and Spain, bishops and abbots collected rents from entire districts of prostitution. In some cities, as much as 30% of church income came from these activities. The justification: theologians like Augustine and Aquinas argued that prostitution was a necessary evil, better that men visit prostitutes than commit adultery with married women or rape virgins. In their twisted logic, the trade preserved social order. So on Sunday, a bishop might thunder from the pulpit about the sin of lust. On Monday, he might collect taxes from the very brothels he condemned. Hypocrisy wasn't the exception, it was the system. But it wasn't just the church that shaped sexual behavior. Doctors too had their say, and their advice might surprise you. In medieval medicine, sex wasn't just pleasure, it was biology. According to the prevailing medical theory, rooted in ancient Greek writings, conception required not just the man's seed, but the woman's as well. And for a woman to release her seed, she had to experience climax. Yes, you heard that correctly. Medieval doctors believed that women had to enjoy sex in order to conceive. Texts like the Trotula, a famous medical compendium from the 12th century, contain detailed instructions on how to ensure women reach satisfaction. Physicians prescribed oils, warming herbs, and even mechanical aids. They advised on positions, rhythms, and timing, all with the goal of maximizing pleasure. Midwives acted as sexual coaches, teaching couples how to align their humors and balance their bodies. Some even provided demonstrations. The church, of course, condemned pleasure as sinful, but medicine demanded it for fertility, and in a society obsessed with producing heirs, fertility often won out over morality. There are records of women suing for annulments on the grounds that their husbands failed to satisfy them, and thus could not help them conceive. In these cases, the courts often sided with the women. It is a striking irony. The same Middle Ages that burned women as witches for their sexuality also recognized female pleasure as medically necessary. In some ways, women in the 12th century may have had more medical acknowledgement of their desire than women in the Victorian era, 700 years later. But if doctors sometimes prescribed satisfaction, they offered little safety when it came to preventing pregnancy, because medieval contraception was not just unreliable, it was deadly. If fertility was celebrated, the control of fertility was feared. In a world where childbirth was as dangerous as battle, many women sought ways to avoid pregnancy. But contraception in the Middle Ages was a desperate gamble, a mix of folk wisdom, toxic ingredients, and whispered recipes passed from mother to daughter in the shadows. Some methods were relatively harmless, like drinking teas made from rue, pennyroyal, or wild carrot. But others were lethal. Mercury-based potions promised to cool the seed, but instead poisoned organs. Lead salts were ground into powders and swallowed, leading to brain damage, paralysis, and death. Copper sulfate, still used in small doses today as a pesticide, was applied internally, burning tender tissue. Other practices were bizarre, inserting sponges soaked in vinegar, using honey-coated wool, or even employing dried animal dung as a barrier. Infection, of course, was almost guaranteed.
One medieval manual even suggested crocodile dung, a recipe borrowed from ancient Egypt and spread through medical texts of the time. Needless to say, it was not only ineffective, but also dangerous. And yet, women took these risks, because pregnancy was not only life-threatening, but also life-altering. For peasant women, another child meant starvation for the family. For noble women, an ill-timed pregnancy could destroy political alliances. Barrier methods did exist, crude condoms made from sheep intestines or fish bladders, but these were condemned by the church as sinful, and they were expensive. Only the wealthy could afford them, and even then, they were often used more to protect against disease than to prevent pregnancy. Those who shared contraceptive knowledge risked being branded as witches. Midwives who passed along recipes or instructions could be accused of sorcery, tried and executed. So women faced a terrible choice: risk pregnancy and death in childbirth, or risk poisoning themselves in secret. Medieval family planning was not so much about planning as it was about survival, and survival sometimes meant turning to an even darker source of power: magic. Few things were more dangerous or more desperate than love magic in the Middle Ages. In a society where marriages were arranged, love was often a luxury, not a given. Women who wanted to win a husband's affection or men who sought to seduce a reluctant partner, turned to potions, powders, and rituals that blurred the line between medicine and witchcraft. The recipes were horrifying. One common spell required mixing wine with a few drops of menstrual blood, secretly fed to the target. Others involved grinding up bone marrow taken from corpses or the organs of executed criminals. Some demanded that the ingredients be stolen from graveyards under moonlight or gathered at crossroads at midnight. Unbaptized infants, the most cursed souls in Christian belief, were said to provide the most potent ingredients. Stories circulated of women digging up fresh graves to steal hair, nails, and bones, all to brew a drink that would bind a lover forever. Did it work? Probably not, beyond the placebo effect. But in a world ruled by superstition, even the suggestion of magic could influence behavior. A man told he had been bewitched might truly begin to feel compelled. A woman told she had drunk a potion might convince herself she was in love. The risks, however, were enormous. Love magic was legally considered witchcraft, and witchcraft was punishable by death. Noble women might escape with a warning or a fine. Poor women often faced the stake. In 1320, a woman named Beatrice de Planisal in southern France was accused of mixing her own blood into her husband's wine to make him more affectionate. She confessed under torture and was burned alive. For many, though, the risk was worth it. In a society where women had little control over their futures, love magic seemed like the only way to bend fate to their will. But if magic was dangerous, breaking marital vows outright was even worse, because adultery wasn't just a sin, it was a public crime, and its punishments were spectacles designed for shame. In the medieval imagination, adultery was not a private failure but a threat to social order, and the punishment reflected that belief. One of the most brutal forms of justice was called la course. If a married man was caught with another woman, the law demanded that he and his partner be tied together with a rope. Stripped to the waist, they were paraded through the town as the crowd jeered, threw mud, and beat them with sticks. The man was forced to walk behind, led by the woman as if she were an animal dragging him by a leash. The symbolism was clear. Lust had inverted the natural hierarchy. The man, who should have been the head, was now humiliated as the tail. Sometimes the punishment was fatal. Men often collapsed under the strain, beaten or trampled to death by the mob. Women might be spared, or they might suffer the same fate. These parades were not secret punishments. They were community events. Shops closed, bells rang, children were brought to watch. Adultery was not just punished, it was turned into a morality play for the whole town. In other cases, adulterers were forced to stand naked at the church door on Sunday, holding candles while the priest denounced them from the pulpit. Some were locked in pillories with signs declaring their crimes. Others were banished entirely, sent into exile with no hope of return. The lesson was always the same. Your body was not yours. Your desires, your failures, your mistakes, they all belonged to the community. And that is perhaps the most chilling truth of all. In the Middle Ages, intimacy was never private. It was public, political, and deeply dangerous. Let's step back and look at the world we've uncovered. A world where men stood trial for impotence before panels of priests and doctors, where wedding nights were public ceremonies, witnessed by nobles, and recorded in official reports, where bishops ran brothels and taxed prostitutes while preaching chastity from the pulpit, where doctors prescribed female pleasure as a medical necessity, even as priests condemned it as sin, where contraception meant swallowing poison, and love potions meant digging up corpses, and where adultery was punished not with whispers behind closed doors, but with public parades, beatings, and exile. This was the Middle Ages, not an age of chastity, but an age where sex was everywhere, regulated, controlled, commodified, and weaponized. And what does it tell us today? That privacy, the idea that what happens in your bedroom belongs to you alone, is a modern invention, that our ancestors lived lives where the most intimate acts were public property, and that many of the freedoms we take for granted, the right to love who we wish, the ability to plan our families safely, the expectation of privacy, were bought with centuries of pain and oppression. So the next time you feel embarrassed about your love life, remember this: at least you don't need to prove your performance in court. At least you don't have nobles at your bedside on your wedding night. At least you don't have to drink corpse marrow for romance, or risk death for contraception. The Middle Ages remind us that history is not just kings and battles. It is the story of ordinary people, their bodies, their desires, and their suffering. And sometimes, that story is darker than we could ever imagine. If this shocked you, good. If it made you grateful for the privacy of modern life, even better.
This has been the dark truth of medieval sexual practices. If you want more hidden histories, more truths that textbooks leave out, subscribe to this channel, share this video with someone who still thinks the Middle Ages were prudish, and leave a comment with the part that shocked you most, because history isn't just about remembering what happened, it's about remembering what it cost, and making sure we never go back.